JP in New York knew ahead of the attack. And about 3 minutes before the attack began, they released a statement, "We are back."
The origin story of making this film obviously goes back to October 7th, 2023. And we saw the horrific images coming out of Israel of babies and children and young people from the Nova Festival and grandparents being murdered, being taken hostage into Gaza. These murders and these kidnappings were being live streamed on Facebook and on Telegram. And I think as this was all unfolding, I would say in particularly the Jewish community, we were shaken to our core. We weren't even sure of what these images were, how horrific it was, but it felt like this was different than anything that has ever happened in Israel before.
It seems like there's coordination, and it looks like it's been years in the making. You'll notice that in the film we talk about how minutes or within hours after the attack, there was a toolkit for that SJP issued, ready to be sent out to all of their activists, basically telling them exactly which hashtags to use, what to shout at the demonstrations. It doesn't seem like something that was hastily prepared in the several hours between the news of the attack and the first demonstrations in New York Times Square. It looks like it's clearly been prepared, and on October 8th, they executed the plan.
I thought we had seen it all. I thought by January we had seen sort of all of the hate really unfold. So to me, when we got to the spring encampments and with all of the tents and with the bodies of people forming human chains and the whole scene with Kiani James, Zionists not allowed, and what was happening not just at Columbia, but it was happening at UCLA, it's happening at UT Austin.
Welcome to Indoctrination, the podcast that exposes and opposes radical ideology in K-12 schools and academia. We examine the illiberal education loop that is teaching students what to think, not how to think. We speak with leaders across the country about the politicized ideology that fosters indoctrination masquerading as education. I'm Dr. Marcy Goldstein.
And I'm Dr. Brandy Shupatinsky, your hosts.
Join us and Americans nationwide. Welcome to our Indoctrination podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. Wendy Sachs, the director, and Nimrod, Erez, one of the producers and an editor. Thank you so much for making this really important and effective film. I watched it in a film festival a few months ago and watched it again this week to prepare for our conversation, and it's a really impactful film. And I thought I'd just start by reading what you have on the film's website, which is October8film.com. And by the way, if anybody hasn't seen it yet, you can find it on all on-demand platforms, Amazon, Apple, etc. And if you would like to organize a screening for a group of people, just go on the website and you can find a place to do that, to get in touch with these people. So it was very interesting when I went to the website. And the film is obviously about anti-Semitism, and the website's homepage has a big picture of the Statue of Liberty, and on it, it says globalize the Intifada, and it says fight for the soul of America. And underneath that is a really good description of the film. I'm just going to read it to set the stage for people so they know what we're going to be discussing. So it says October 8 offers a look at the explosion of anti-Semitism on college campuses, social media, and in the streets of America, beginning the day after the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. Through meticulous investigation, the film also uncovers how over decades, Hamas created sophisticated networks in America to permeate US institutions and examines the tsunami of online anti-Semitism, propaganda, and disinformation unleashed by Iran, China, and Russia with the sole purpose of dividing American society. So maybe I'll just begin by asking you, stemming from that, why did you make this film?
Well, thank you for that, Marcy. You just set up what the film's about. It is about the explosion of anti-Semitism on college campuses and in the streets of America in the aftermath of October 7th. And the origin story of making this film obviously goes back to October 7th, 2023. And we saw, the horrific images coming out of Israel of babies and children and young people from the Nova Festival and grandparents being murdered, being taken hostage into Gaza. These murders and these kidnappings were being live streamed on Facebook and on Telegram. And I think as this was all unfolding, we were all, not maybe just the Jewish community, but I would say in particularly the Jewish community, we were shaken to our core. It was epic. We weren't even sure of what these images were, how horrific it was, but it felt like this was different than anything that has ever happened in Israel before. And I think so many of us just felt gutted. But for me, it was really the next day. It was on October 8th when I saw what was happening in Times Square and saw images from around the world, the streets of London, Australia, what was happening in Europe. But really for me, being, I live in New Jersey and I was watching what was happening in New York City. And it was Hamas being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than being condemned as terrorists, and then seeing what was happening on college campuses, right? We knew on October 8th that more than 30 student groups had signed on to a letter at Harvard blaming Israel for the attack on itself,
including children.
I thought that the entire globe would be in mourning, and not only was it silent, there was jubilation.
It was exhilarating, it was energizing.
I wasn't seeing an ideological disagreement. I was seeing hatred.
Free Palestine!
The hate started flooding in almost immediately.
Students called it resistance, they called it justified, they began calling Zionist students racist.
We are Hamas!
And it was a domino effect at all of these college campuses at Cornell and at Brown and at Tulane and at NYU and at MIT. And, the list goes on. And it was as if Israel had it coming. Right. So to me, it was not just the sort of hostility and the rage, the venom targeting Israel and blaming Israel. It was also then the silence that we saw from women's rights organizations and UN Women and social justice organizations. And for me personally, my own professional network of women, high profile women who are always vocal on all of the other issues, whether it was, 2020 and George Floyd, whether it was Boko Haram and Bring Back Our Girls, or immigration issues. They were nowhere to be found. There was silence. So to me, it was the hostility, the aggression, the sort of visceral hate of Israel, together with the silence to condemn what we knew what was happening and what had happened with the raping and the mutilation and the kidnapping of girls and women, that I decided that I needed to document what was happening, that this was just an epic moment on so many levels. And about 2 weeks after October 7th, I wrote a treatment for the film and I started production.
I think that looking back now and seeing the celebration of the attack and of the massacre and the continued support and cheerleading of the terrorists who committed it, looking back, it seems like October 7th acted kind of like a call to action. And the individuals that we see, whether it's the encampments or marching down the streets calling for the genocide of Jews, answered that call. What do you attribute that to?
I attribute that to decades of priming young people and professors at universities to arrive at that conclusion that Israel doesn't have the right to exist and that it is a genocidal apartheid state. And it seems like, in a way, they were waiting for the right moment to act. I think many of your viewers probably are aware that there's a lawsuit that was submitted in New York just in the last 2-3 weeks on behalf of 6 victims of October 7th, I believe. 2 of them are still dead and held in Gaza, unfortunately. One of the allegations in the lawsuit is that SJP in New York knew ahead of the attack, and that about 3 minutes before the attack began, they released a statement, "We are back." So it seems like there's coordination, and it looks like it's been years in the making. You'll notice that in the film we talk about how minutes or within hours after the attack, there was a toolkit for that SJP issued, ready to be sent out to all of their activists, basically telling them exactly which hashtags to use, what to shout at the demonstrations. It doesn't seem like something that was like hastily prepared in the several hours between the news of the attack and the first demonstrations in New York Times Square. So it looks like it's clearly been prepared, and on October 8th, they executed the plan.
Foreign state and non-state actors are seeding the online space with false narratives in order to impact the stability of Western democracy.
30 years ago, leaders of Hamas in America met and discussed strategy to hijack students' minds.
Israel, adapting the concept of intifada. Violence will follow.
This is not about Jews. This is about democracy. This is about human decency.
What does it mean that the future leaders of the most important democracy in the world are chanting for intifada? What is the country going to look like a decade from now?
What is at stake is the soul of America.
So you mentioned that the kids are primed to see Israel as a genocidal state. And I just want to maybe back up and discuss how the ideology is systemic. I think in academia, the oppressor versus oppressed ideology, which people have bought and swallowed, and it's captured all sorts of classes across different disciplines. So maybe you can explain that a little bit further for people who don't understand why the kids are siding with Hamas, why Hamas rapists are still oppressed even when they're raping women, why hostage posters are being torn down when babies were abducted. Like, how are these people oppressors? Something sank into the culture of academia for decades, like one of you said. But I think we can tease that out for people because it's like an invisible framework that everybody is in and they don't realize it. So it's very hard to explain to people who don't understand it yet, how extreme reaction happened on the campuses while October 7th was basically still unfolding.
So I think it's complicated. This isn't, it's not an easy answer. And it's not just academia. It's not like all of these students are sitting at Columbia University in sociology classes or humanities classes with faculty members who are drinking the Kool-Aid of the oppressor-oppressed binary and SJP and all of that. I will tell you that a lot of this is coming from social media and from TikTok. And we get into that in the film also, of this sort of 54-to-1 imbalance with algorithms and the pro-Israel or so-called more pro-Israel or sympathetic to Israel's posts being seen 54-to-1. Well, I guess there's 54. Let me position this. There are 54 times more pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian hashtags than there are sympathetic to Israel ones or pro-Israel ones. And when we spoke to social media experts, they really dug into that and dug into the authenticity of these posts. And we know that bot farms from foreign actors like China and Iran and Russia, they have their finger on the scale. They're trying to atomize America. They're trying to break apart our democracy and trying to break apart our young people and our population. And by the way, this is happening in other parts of the world too, with other global conflicts. It's not just the Israel-Palestinian one. But we know that these are not authentic posts. We can also sort of have another conversation about what's happening to our film, but with bot farms, review bombing our IMDb page, also not authentic. So there are foreign actors involved. So we have young people who are, their brains, their minds, their attitudes are being hijacked by propaganda online that's trying to paint a very dark picture of Israel as the apartheid state, as the colonial state, as the oppressor. And it's working. We're definitely seeing the impact of all of this propaganda for all of these years, meeting also what's happening in the media and the media bias that's coming from the media. And it's also coming from NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that also have their own bias when it comes to Israel as this, colonial apartheid genocidal state. And, that together has become the perfect storm. So it's complicated. And on top of that, we're talking about intersectionality, which is so common on campuses today and in more progressive circles. This idea of, if you're for climate change, then you're for LGBTQ rights and you're for reproductive freedom, then you're also for the Palestinian cause. And we unpack in the film that the Palestinians are sort of the gold standard of oppression, right? They're sort of the highest level of on the hierarchy of who's oppressed. So if you're for all these other social justice issues and you're on the side of good and you're on the side of humanity, then you're on the side of Palestinians / pro-Hamas. But I would also argue that a lot of these young people, they're not necessarily anti-Semitic. I think that they really, truly think they're on the right side of the issue, but they just don't know. Some are definitely haters, but so many more really just don't know much. They think that they're doing the right thing.
It's interesting that you mentioned that they think that they're doing the right thing, because we've seen this kind of empathy gap in younger kids. So a lot of my focus has been on K through 12 education and what's going on there, and how, kids don't arrive on, freshman year college campus with these ideas just come instantly once they're on campus. They've been primed sometimes years before in their K through 12 education. And we're seeing this seep from academia into K-12, where kids are getting a lot more information through social media. Some teachers are too, unfortunately, creating lessons using social media videos, including TikTok. But we're also seeing a lack of knowledge dissemination. So I'm just curious if you looked into anything related to the K-12 space.
It's a question I was hoping to answer later in the podcast, but our next project is actually going to be a much deeper dive into what is happening at K-12 and colleges, of course. It's basically drilling down on the curriculum and how an ideology from the far left met money from outside of America to create this perfect storm that we're all experiencing right now.
And what about all the foreign funding? So obviously there's foreign actors messing with the social media and the algorithms, as you so nicely explain in the film. The film just does such an incredible job. I learned so much more watching it a second time because there's so much detail in there and it's all woven together very, very well. So what about the foreign funding? I've seen this chart going around where there's billions of dollars over the past X number of years that come from a certain number of hostile countries, and they go to mostly a certain number of universities. There's like the top 10 maybe. So what do you make of that? And, what is the effect of that? How do we stop it? And since you made the film, there's a new executive order to explore that, I think. So what do you think the outcome of that is going to be?
There's a few things about the foreign funding that actually tie to like a previous question that was asked about the origins of what we're seeing right now. Wendy mentioned how it's really about atomizing American society, and it's really true. And the actual origins of this concept as Israel as a white colonialist transplant in the Middle East originated with Soviet Russia as a wedge issue to create a cleave between the Arab world and the United States. And it basically, from there, it jumped into leftist circles in academia in America, and it was obviously, absorbed with glee. And the thing is that right now we're seeing some kind of a repeat of that with foreign countries basically tipping the scale. It's not necessarily about the Jews. It depends who is the foreign actor that is supporting that. It's not necessarily about the Jews, but the ultimate intention is to weaken America. And that's why on our poster, as you mentioned before, we have the tagline, "The fight for the soul of America," because it's ultimately about what is happening for this country, as a whole, basically. Now, in terms of the foreign funding, it really depends on who the source of the foreign funding is, because different countries have different ambitions and different reasons to do that. Money that comes from the Middle East is truly centered around the Palestinian issue. There's a lot of money being poured in from China and from Russia as well. I just saw a chart. Russia is, I think, the number 7 or 8 largest foreign donor to universities in America in the last 15 years. I don't think that we need to explore what their motivations are. It's clear to everybody. And that's where we're at right now. Yeah.
The Qataris are really trying to own America, though. I mean, we're seeing it in every which way, whether it's sports teams or arenas, but they've been targeting academia for decades now. Georgetown, Northwestern, Texas A&M, where they, had given hundreds of millions of dollars for research. It's pretty nefarious. And I think your question also, Marcy, is is anything going to happen? What are we going to see coming out of all of this? I think we know that this administration is taking it pretty seriously, but it's really interesting. And this is what Nimrod's talking about for our next project that we're going to really dig into, looking at the receipts to try to understand what's really the cause and effect, because I think that is the question, right? They give, and I'm going to give Northwestern as an example because I know more about that school since that's my alma mater, and I'm obsessed with the idea that they have a journalism campus in Doha, and they have for about a dozen years. I was really curious about that a dozen years ago when I saw my alumni magazine bragging about this Doha campus. And after October 7th, I became really obsessed with trying to understand what's happening there, looking at teachers and the curriculum and trying to understand where that $600 million has gone. They had a longstanding relationship with Al Jazeera, the journalism school. Okay. They just broke off that relationship about 3 months ago under pressure. But what I've heard from very close sources to the president of the university is the U.S. government has wanted these universities to have campuses in Doha. They're seeing this as a strategic alliance for us to have universities there. So it's a symbiotic relationship, which is also problematic. But at the same time, we have our biggest Air Force base in the Middle East is based in Doha. So this is like the enemy of your enemy is your friend, and they're paying for it. So the enemy of your enemy is your friend kind of a thing. You're in bed with, your enemy. It's very strange, but I don't know actually what's going to result. And I wonder if the administration will actually back off, as they do on lots of other issues. There's a lot of people who have very senior positions in the government that are very close to the Qataris. So I don't know what's actually going to happen, but I know that we're going to try to unpack what this funding does, what the fallout is, and it certainly is trickling down into K through 12. There seems to be no doubt about it, at least in our preliminary research. But we're looking really for the receipts, and the reason that we didn't dig in more on October 8th, when we started to look at this, it seemed to be very gray. It was very hard to really uncover what the money's actually doing. We saw those initial stories coming out in the free press and elsewhere right after October 7th. And it seems, you scratch your head and it seems pretty nefarious, but you're not really sure what it is. So the next project, we're going to try to really dig in and try to understand what's going on.
I would say that the one good thing that is happening right now is that in the past, a university only had to declare that they received funding from a foreign actor, let's say. They didn't have to report what they were doing with that money. Now there is legislation being put together that will force universities to also show the receipts of what they're actually doing with the money, which would increase visibility into what the universities are doing, and will actually shed light on the intent of the foreign donors.
It's so interesting and scary thinking that foreign actors could have that much power and influence over our different communities here, through whether it's through academia, through media, through K through 12 education. I wonder with that, and also your point, Wendy, that there seems to be a symbiotic relationship. I think that can also be kind of one of the things that at least people in the United States think only goes one way, thinking that we're going to use our power and influence to kind of reshape another society and not see that it can go the other way or maybe both ways. In fact, I would argue that in academia, we're kind of paying the price of that relationship now. Besides obviously getting money or maybe being able to get some buildings put up, what have you found? If you found anything, what's the point of these universities having these types of relationships with Qatar, having a campus in Doha, having a relationship with Al Jazeera? What's the draw?
Well, again, it's definitely money. So, and just for some perspective, the journalism school at the Evanston campus, when I was a student there, it's a population of about 8,000 students at Northwestern. The journalism school is 160 kids. It's tiny. It's very elite, and it's teeny, teeny, tiny. I wanted to know how much money that was going to Doha. Like, that must be a really big journalism school also, right? Or sorry, it must be bigger than 160 is what I was thinking. Why else would there be $600 million just for that school? The school size is basically the same, around 200 students. Okay, so it's a small school. It's a tiny campus. It's in, what do they call it, university campus or whatever in Doha. It's called like University something or other. We're also Texas, and A&M and Georgetown is located. It's this, Doha created this, right? Or Qatar created this like university campus, and it's a consortium of schools there. The relationship was, so all I have to say is it's a lot of money going into Northwestern's pockets, and they're very happy about it. The connection to Al Jazeera is an obvious one. I mean, Al Jazeera is the arm of Qatar. It's the arm of arguably Hamas. It's the arm of, terror. And it's the national, broadcasting station of Qatar. And then they are down the street from Northwestern, and Northwestern would brag about the internships that their students are doing there, the professors that are coming from Al Jazeera and teaching media classes to these students. And then Northwestern goes on to tell you where all of these students wind up, where their jobs are after they graduate. They're at the New York Times, they're at the BBC, they're at NPR, they're at Vogue magazine, right? These are the bragging rights. When you go to Northwestern in Qatar, this is where you land. And it's incredibly problematic. Now, why are they doing it? Again, what I'm hearing is the American government for all of these years has actually said, we're happy that you're there. Keep, it's good to, have some like boots on the ground in Doha and to have American universities in Qatar. So I haven't been privy to those conversations directly. I can only tell you what I'm hearing, but this is something that we really want to explore in the next project of what is this? What is the origin of it? What's the sort of strategic thinking behind it? And obviously it's been corrupted. We know that. And, the money is going from Qatar and from these foreign actors to fund fellowships, to fund curriculum, to fund professors. And as Nimrod talks about all the time when we do Q&As, he's like, I think the Jewish community that's been, very generously putting their names on buildings and libraries and hospitals and all sorts of things, funding the arts, now really need to turn around and start funding curriculum and funding, chairing departments, because that's where the difference is going to be made. We've been asleep at the wheel. This has been going on for decades. And, October 8th really saw the results of not understanding and being quiet for way too long and not seeing what was happening.
And when Wendy says that Al Jazeera is like basically a mouthpiece for Hamas, it's I have to say that Al Jazeera has been banned in Egypt, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, and in Israel as well. By the way, guess which is the only country that got flack for shutting down Al Jazeera? It wasn't Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, Saudi Arabia, or any other country.
It was Israel.
It was. Just to clarify, it was Israel.
I'm going to guess that's the country you're referring to.
I'm flashing back to what you featured in the film about the New York Times trusting Hamas's report that the hospital was bombed and then revising it again and again and again, which, now I can see why.
So yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, one of the things we get into in the film, and the film is just packed, right? It's very robust in what we tried to cover. I had a lot of ideas of everything that I needed to sort of jam into a digestible film for people to watch, and one of it is really unpacking media bias that we know has been going on also for decades. And instead of for so many of us who follow the news from coming out of Israel, people will say, oh, the New York Times is terrible on Israel. The Washington Post is terrible. NPR, the BBC, you name this sort of general mainstream broadcast or print publication. So we wanted to focus on a moment, right? We wanted to be able to showcase exactly what it looks like. And that October 17th so-called bombing of the hospital was a perfect example. There were arguably a dozen others that followed. But early on, I remember that really breaking through and creating so much chaos because I was watching it in my kitchen in real time as, they were blaming Israel. And you see these headlines that are being, sent out on everyone's phones. You're getting these notifications right away that Israel's bombed a hospital, 500 people dead, as if how did they already determine that? And I remember watching on CNN and watching the IDF spokesman just saying, hold on, wait a second. We're looking into this, and holding my breath personally, because we know that if the IDF has actually done this, this is terrible. And so we were all like nauseated, waiting for the result to come out, but it didn't matter. The New York Times, and then followed by CNN and all the other national news publications and international news, are putting out the false statements, the false, headlines, and it's too late. And I think what we wanted to really show in the film, and we, as the story unravels, we then see that the oldest synagogue in Tunisia is burned to the ground with chants of, kill the Jews. Like, there are ramifications for when the media gets it wrong. And the fact that that newsroom, the New York Times, decided to go with Hamas's account of the attack rather than waiting actually for something credible, whether you like the IDF or not. It is a democratic nation with a military that you have to be able to, have some sort of trust in, and not go with a terror organization, an organization that the United States identifies as a terror group. Why would the New York Times go with Hamas's version of the account? I mean, it just shows you the sort of level of bias and hypocrisy. And I don't know, I thought it was a great sort of example, some microcosm of something just sort of a massive problem that we have. So going back, Marcy, to young people and students, these young people who might not be sitting in Ivy League universities or on the East Coast or in Berkeley on the West Coast, they're also watching the news. And when they're hearing time and again of what the Israelis are doing, right, committing these heinous acts, that is penetrating these young people. And
it was very important for us in the film to show in that scene, the day after, Representative Rashida Tlaib was at an event and she was condemning Israel for bombing a hospital with children, which of course didn't happen at that time.
And I wonder how many professors took the time to explore the fact that the New York Times trusted Hamas and was wrong. Like, how much viewpoint diversity shows up in the classroom? Obviously, we don't know, and it maybe is different in different classrooms and different campuses. But one thing that I see is the lack of viewpoint diversity. So is that bias going to be explored and revealed to see all of the nuance? Like you mentioned, that it's very complex, and there is this sort of anti-Israel tendency. So I'd like to think that as the New York Times revised its headline, and I remember seeing the 3 different headlines, stacked up on maybe Honest Reporting or something like that. What a great learning moment. And I wonder how many students actually got to learn from that.
I want to say something about that moment in the film where you see the 3 headlines. So the moment that you see in the film is from one social media activist that we were able to obtain the video. The reason why we had to use that video is because there is no way to find anywhere the New York Times previous headlines than the current one. We could not find copies on the New York Times website, on their own time capsule, let's call it, of their own previous reporting, their own different versions of that headline. So to me, that was like, why aren't they keeping that? Because they know that they've done something bad and they don't want to get crucified for it. And it's very telling that that's the only that's the only proof that we had, is that young woman's social media video, that she was smart enough to screen capture the New York Times headlines before they changed them.
Something that was interesting about the headline part, something else, is that the truth came out, the headline painted the situation as much more innocent. When Israel was able to be blamed, it was very, very like hard hitting and heavy, the words used. And as the truth came out, that lessened. There's something also that struck me with the claiming of the hospital bombing and then every other falsehood that was stated during the war, is that it looked like watching live over months lynching, where a lie is told, a mob gets riled up, and they go out and street justice ensues where they attack innocents. And that's what I feel like we've been experiencing since October 8th, where lies are told, people are getting riled up, and they're committing violence. And the switch from being anti-Israel to being anti-Jew seemed to happen really quickly.
I don't think there's much of a line between being anti-Israel and anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. I think that line has disappeared. And it's something that comes up over and over again, because, one of the themes and one of the points we're trying to make in this film is that modern day anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism.
And vice versa.
And that there's no light between, and vice versa. There's no light between that anymore. I was at another screening last night in Westchester, New York, and someone raised their hand and they're like, yeah, but really, like, what do you say to people who say it's just not really true? And when they're targeting synagogues, right, they're not targeting the Bibi Netanyahu government. This is not about land disputes. It's not about the settlements or terrible activity happening in the settlements. It's not about any of that. It's about Jews. When they're going after Starbucks, right? Again, they're not going after Bibi's policies or what's happening, again, with land disputes. Like, that's not what it's about. It's very, very clear what this is about. And it's about hatred against Jews and Israelis. But let's start with the Jews here in America. And it's like the gloves are off. People just feel like it's free reign on Jews. And frankly, that's what it's about. I mean, but there is something also happening with this sort of fanatical, obsessive hate of Israel that then also makes hating Jews okay. So I think that it is this sort of like this weird sort of symbiotic thing happening between Israelis and Jews, whether they're here in America or they're in Australia or they're in Canada or they're in the UK or anywhere in Europe, to be honest.
And we wanted also to explain in the film that denying Jews the right for self-determination is in itself anti-Semitic, inherently, basically, because it's the only minority in the world that is excluded in that way, that their rights for self-determination are denied. I can't think of any other minority group around the world that would declare themselves. And the Palestinians are one of those groups, by the way, that would declare themselves desiring self-determination that the extreme left will not support, except for the Jewish people. And there's many reasons why that is, and we can get into that at some point if you want as well.
That's a very good point. I think that the film made that point very clear. And I think watching the reactions to people here in the United States made it clear that this isn't about disagreeing with any Israeli government. It's very much just an anti-Jewish movement. And for me, it raises the question I hope gets discussed more is, has it always been? Has this always just been an excuse to target Jews, regardless of of where we are?
I think more so now than before. I think it's been progressing for the past few decades. Hating Israel isn't so new. But it was a little more fringe, I would say 10 years ago. And it's really crossed into the mainstream now. And listen, and that's also a complicated, I think it's complicated. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's reasons behind it. And you can't also deny what's happening in Israel. We can't just say they've done nothing wrong and that there's nothing terrible happening there. Like any country, they're not perfect. Like any country, they have leadership that you want to be critical of. But something happens with Israel where they are under a spotlight, they're under a magnifying glass in a way that no other country is. And they're held to a different standard. And I think that in itself is also what's so anti-Semitic. They are a democratic nation, the only one in the Middle East. And yet they are constantly portrayed as this apartheid state. And once you call, a country an apartheid state, like, that is the worst of the worst, right? So that is delegitimizing its right to exist. And that, of course, like Nimrod just said before, that's anti-Semitism. But that has been developing over time. And in the past few years, it's really just entered the mainstream, particularly with young people. And I would argue, again, going back to TikTok and social media, it's been aggravated by that. And it's just exploded.
You touched on so much. I think you almost mentioned the 3 Ds that define anti-Semitism. So double standards, delegitimization, and I think the third one is demonization. And so when those three things happen, or even just one of them, I guess, that would reveal that it's not just a bias, but it's actually, anti-Jewish bigotry or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes I think the word anti-Semitism is too cosmeticized a term even to identify what's going on.
Yeah, it's a little too benign, right?
Yeah. Also, I think some of this goes back to lack of knowledge. Like, the students don't know that the Jews are from Judea. Like, if they're fighting for the rights of indigenous populations, for indigenous people to have self-determination and sovereignty in their ancient homeland, we need to know who is from where. And when people shout, go back to Poland, some of them know that Jews are not originally from Poland. And that needs to be taught. I said earlier that you're developing educational materials to go along with the film. And I'd love to hear more about that because there's so much to unpack stemming from this, rich film.
One thing I do want to just jump in, I think you're absolutely right, Marcy. Young people don't know about the Jewish people's ties, biblical ties to the state of Israel, to Israel, to Judea and Samaria. Like, they just don't know. They honestly, so many people think it's a manifestation of a post-World War II 1948 period. And somehow the Jews somehow wound up with the Palestinian land, and this sort of rewriting of history or erasing history. I mean, it feels like we're in a dystopia. Like, it just makes no sense. To anyone who, by the way, went to Sunday school, to any Christian young person out there who went to Sunday school, they would just know better. And yet they seem to not, or seem to be in denial, or again, their brains have just been manipulated and hijacked. So yes, we agree about education and just basic facts, which we tried to do in this film. I tried to shove in as many data points as possible. I was also really obsessed with people knowing how few Jews there are in America and in the world. Even that, less than 3% here in America was such an important data point I wanted to drive, because the numbers that people think, and I would ask my cameramen and my crews, how many Jews do you think are in America? And people inevitably would say 25 to 30%. So that was shocking. I mean, but shocking, but I guess maybe not. So that was something we wanted to really educate people with through this film. As far as what are our teaching materials right now, I'll let Nimrod speak to that, because they're very aspirational at this point as we move on to the long tail mission of the film, which is getting this into education.
Well, I mean, we are in a very, very early stage of developing a curriculum, still talking to vendors that can help us develop that curriculum. And we're hoping to have something ready like for early next school year. We are debating whether we do that as a tag along to Holocaust education. We're not sure about like what our entry point exactly would be, but we're hoping that by next fall we will have something to go along with the film. We do have interest from schools in New Jersey, in Connecticut, in Georgia. So in New York, there's a request to screen the film to teachers. We're welcoming all of these requests and working very hard to make it happen.
I find in my own teaching, by the way, that putting up a map of the Middle East is really effective. So I've taught world religions for a few decades, and a very conspicuous absence in some of these textbooks is a map of the Middle East. They just zoom in on Israel, and I have my suspicions as to why, and I think it's because they don't really want people to know how tiny Israel is. So I remember this one moment when I was teaching at UNC Charlotte very vividly. So of course I add a map because it didn't exist in the book, and I put it up on the front of the classroom, and this student leaned in and was just shocked. How could the colonial regime of Israel be that little speck? And I said, yeah, so a map, tells so much. Just let it sit there.
In the film, we show the map twice in the film. We show it once to basically like show all the terrorist organization and enemy states surrounding Israel. And the second time that we show it is to show the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands between 1946, let's say, and the mid-1950s, and how all of the Jews that were living in the Arab world, around 850,000 of them, had to flee, basically, because there was no room for them, as Dr. Einat Wilf explains at that scene. Once anti-Zionism becomes the reigning ideology, Jews understand it, and there's no room for them to stay wherever they are. And we're seeing it on U.S. campuses. We see that at Harvard, for instance, the rate of Jewish applicants has dropped for the next school year. It's exactly because of that.
And why did you change the name of the film? I noticed a few months ago it went from being October 8th to October 8th.
That was from our distributor. They really wanted to make sure the film had the broadest reach possible. And they didn't want to editorialize the name. Hate was creative with the letter A as the number 8. So we were doing a play on words, a play with the number. We have animation that sort of leaned into that idea. So we maintain the integrity of it, and you see 8 with the animation, hate with the animation, but we just kept it as October 8th, which I honestly, that was always my, that was sort of the title that I liked after I came up with another title that we dropped earlier on. And we just wanted to make sure that it appealed to the biggest group possible. But I think that October 8th really says it all, that the film's not about October 7th. It's about the aftermath. And also for search, it's a little funky to have the number 8 as your letter A. So just for basic search reasons, that was the other reason.
It helped us at the beginning to go with October Hate, though. When we first went out with the film in October and November of last year, it was primarily to the Jewish community. And when Jewish people saw that play on word with hate and the letter A being replaced by the number 8, it immediately telegraphed to them what this film is about. And I think that it really helped us in the beginning. But for wider audiences, it makes a lot of sense to change it to October 8. And I don't think that Wendy and I or anyone attached to the film regrets that.
I have one last question. It's a two-parter. I'm curious what surprised you the most in the process of making this film and telling the stories of all of the people that you were able to speak with, and then what inspired you the most?
And that's such a good question. Nimrod, you want to answer that first, and then I'll answer it.
I'm afraid that my answer will steal yours too, Wendy. I think that Wendy and I are both voracious news consumers, and we thought that we knew a lot on almost everything there is to know. I at least thought that. But then when Wendy...
I'm a little more humble. That is arrogant.
A little more humble. But when Wendy interviewed Lorenzo Vidino George Washington University. He's the head or at the Department of Extremism at George Washington University, and he brought us the story of the Hamas meeting in Philadelphia in 1993. That was a piece of information that I've never heard of before. And the SJP scene that I was working on for months really needed like that kind of moment. And Lorenzo brought it, and it was amazing. It actually it changed the whole concept of the scene because it gave that historical context for what we're seeing right now and what we talked about earlier in the podcast. So that was like the most surprising moment per se. In terms of like the most inspirational is just to see the young people in the film, like how articulate they are, how unabashed they are in their support for Israel, how proud they are of their identity, that they actually get the issue that it's yes, it's about Israel, it's about Jews, but it's not only about Israel and Jews, it's about the entire Western world as we know it and want it to be. And the way that they're not cowering or breaking down, they truly are the future of leadership. And I think that we are in very, very good hands.
So for me, I think what was most surprising, given that I started working on the film really the end of October, my first shoot was November 14th, the big Israel rally in Washington, D.C., where there were 300,000 people plus who showed up. And then we saw what was happening on college campuses. I also happened to be in the congressional hearing of the college presidents. The whole, it's context dependent. I was there for that. I was at the United Nations hearing with Sheryl Sandberg. And so I was at all of these sort of like major moments early on and on the college campuses. But what surprised me was the escalation. I thought we had seen it all. I thought by January, we had seen sort of all of the hate really unfold. So to me, when we got to the spring encampments and with all of the tents and with the bodies of people forming human chains and the whole scene with Kiani James, Zionists Not Allowed, and what was happening not just at Columbia, but it's happening at UCLA, it's happening at UT Austin. That surprised me that the temperature was getting hotter and hotter all year, which, definitely helped our film and the momentum of the film and the direction. And I knew that I wanted to end at the end of the school year, but it just kept increasing up until graduation. I mean, Columbia had to cancel their graduation. USC had to cancel their graduation. So that was very unexpected, made for, a great film because you're looking for tension. So that was sort of naturally baked into just a chronology of events. But what was most inspiring to me, like Nimrod says, I always speak about the young people. I mean, they are incredible. They are so poised. They have such a conviction about them and such a strong sense of identity that they give me hope. They inspire me. I feel very good about our future, not just, in the Jewish community, but in the broader community. Like, these will be our patriots moving forward. They will be the leaders to come. And I think we're in good hands with, these young people who are stepping up.
That's so great to hear. And I know people are trying to bring others to see the film. I've heard some people express concern that the people who already know what the problem is are going to see the film, but how do we get people to go see it who don't realize what's going on? And I've heard people saying, well, I'm going to buy it for my friends and I'm going to buy a streaming version and have a party at home. And I just think that's so important to help grow the allyship, have allies, partnerships. And really, Hamas is your problem too, is I think a phrase that I've heard floated around. And I hope that more and more people watch the film to realize what's going on so that we can all deal with it together. So thank you so much for this incredible conversation, making the film and what you're working on. We will be looking forward to hearing everything that's coming from you.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I think that on a different side, I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to hear what you had to hear to make it. I appreciate that, because that's a sacrifice that doesn't get talked about enough when you're talking to filmmakers who make something so important, but difficult to hear. So I just want to express my thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to support our work, subscribe to YouTube and follow us on our socials. The links are in the description.